Welcome to a world of thinkers, dreamers, and doers. A place where intellectual curiosity and active research accelerate entrepreneurship and innovation before bringing them into being. This is the Roberto C. Goizueta Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. Within Atlanta's vibrant heart, the center is a nexus for the Goizueta and Emory community, serving entrepreneurs to investors, students to startups. This is an intimate environment where connections are easily made and relationships are readily built, making the center a microcosm that offers macro opportunities. This is where you'll find a cultivated entrepreneurial ecosystem bristling with possibilities that foster partnership with the business community surrounding us, a growing, unique network of businesses and organizations. Tomorrow has to start somewhere, and we're defining the future right here. Don't think of it as an idea incubator as much as a curiosity super collider. The center blurs lines across disciplines, programs, and areas of expertise, serving to connect ideas to resources, founders to mentors, and the classroom to the community. And while great minds think differently, this is where they come together, uncovering intersections of entrepreneurship and innovation that elevate business while bettering society. We meet our community of entrepreneurs and innovators where they are, and then empower, educate, and inspire them to get where they're going. It all starts here at the Roberto C. Goizueta Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation.
Good evening, and welcome everyone to the launch of the Roberto C. Goizueta Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. I'm Karen Sedatal, Interim Dean for Emory University's Goizueta Business School. We're thrilled that you could be here with us for this momentous occasion. At Goizueta Business School, we prepare principled leaders to have a positive influence on business and society. We deliver world-class educational experiences and opportunities for our students. We convene the brightest minds to solve the biggest problems with integrity, ingenuity, and grit. The new center will foster both entrepreneurship and innovation for the Goizueta community, born of critical inquiry, developed to serve fundamental societal needs, executed according to sound business principles, and conceptualized in ways that open possibilities and spark imagination. The launch of this center represents an expanded scope and elevated commitment to entrepreneurship and innovation at Goizueta. I'm so proud of the staff, faculty, and community partners that have made this possible. We're particularly grateful to the Goizueta Foundation, which generously supported the creation of this center with their transformational gift to the school in 2019. So thank you for joining us. We have a wonderful program in store for you today. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Jill Perry-Smith, Senior Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives, who will provide a brief overview of the CEI priorities and initiatives and introduce you to the team. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Karen. It is my pleasure to overview the center's activities, focus areas, and core initiatives. The center has 3 areas of focus: entrepreneurship, investors, and innovators. The center offers a wide variety of programs in each of these areas, including Pitch the Professors, where students have the opportunity to get support for their early ideas and business models, to the Startup Launch Accelerators, where promising entrepreneurs come to validate their ideas and customer demand models, to the Raise Forum, where more established startups can pitch angel and VC investors to fund their ideas. The center provides, in sum, experiential and classroom learning, ecosystem connections, access to experts in residence and investor exposure, and finally, one-on-one support for entrepreneurs, investors, and corporate innovators, including our students, alumni, and those in the Atlanta entrepreneurship ecosystem. It is my pleasure to thank the team who is the energy, the drive, and the force behind the center's activities. Professor Rob Kazanzian, Professor Andrea Hershatter, Professor Charlie Getz, and Amelia Schaffner, I thank you. Those in the community will have the opportunity to continue to engage with the team through our 3 upcoming panels. There's something for everyone. If you're an entrepreneur, an investor, an innovator, a student, an alumni, an entrepreneur in the community, please join us for one of our 3 engaging panels as we continue to celebrate and mark the launch of the Roberto C. Goizueta Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. It is my pleasure to now turn things over to Rob Kazanjian, who will lead a conversation with alumnus Bill Carr. Rob?
Thank you, Joe, and welcome all. It's a pleasure to be with us. This is an exciting time for us, and I'm very pleased that we're able to engage with an alum, Bill Carr, who I'm happy to introduce at this point, and share with him and you what we're going to do next. So I'm actually already having a challenge sharing my screen. Let me ask if Sydney can put the slide up for the next slide that I had listed there, if that's okay. So Bill, I'm happy to have you join us for the session today. As we thought about the topic of the 3 pillars of focusing on entrepreneurship, focusing on investors, and focusing on innovation in large companies, Bill turned out to be the perfect choice for this position. So I want to give you a little background on Bill and what he's done, and then talk in a moment about his recent book and how it fits so well into what we're looking at. So Bill is a graduate of Colby College in Maine and came to the business school at Goizueta in 1992. And in fact, he was here before we were the Goizueta Business School. We were at that point in time the Emory Business School. And so Bill was here actually at an interesting time in the history of the school. He was participating in something we called at the time the Business Customer Development Track, which we partnered with Procter & Gamble. It was a very early experiential program, the only school in the country partnering with P&G on that. And it was directed at trying to connect P&G to their retail customers more strongly. He was also an early participant in the precursor to the Goizueta Impact Program, the marketing strategy competition. So he was involved in some formative things at the school and has gone on to do great things since then. So after a start with Procter & Gamble out of the MBA program, he joined Amazon in 1999. I think they had about 7,000 to 7,500 employees at the time. I think today they're at about probably 1 million employees. But was involved in a lot of formative elements for the company. So as vice president of digital media, Bill launched and managed the company's global digital music and video businesses, including Amazon Music, Prime Video, and Amazon Studios. He was there till 2014, I believe. And then after Amazon, Bill was an executive in residence with Mavron LLC, an early stage consumer-only venture capital firm. Later, Bill served as the chief operating officer of OfferUp, the largest mobile marketplace for local buyers and sellers in the US. And today, Bill is an author and co-founder of Working Backwards. So I hope you can see the slide on his book. It came out yesterday, and I had a chance to go through it. I found it to be captivating work, very detailed, very applicable in terms of understanding what it is that Amazon has been doing, and why they do what they do and how they do what they do. And one of the things I like about it most is at a level of detail that really lets you kind of come to grips with what their approach has been. I'm usually distrustful of books that have a number in the title, such as the 10 things a firm must always do. And he's avoided that greatly. So I think we're in for a great discussion. And Bill, welcome to our launch.
Rob, it's a pleasure to be with you and be here for this exciting moment for the Goizueta Business School. So thanks for having me.
Great, thanks. And Cindy, go to the next slide if you could. So let me just tell you a little bit about the book. I had a chance to get an advanced copy. I actually got my hard copy today. But the book actually in the front end does a great job of laying out a number of the things that Amazon has designed into their system. And so leadership principles are front and center at the front end of this. And then there's a discussion of some kind of mechanisms and processes that the company uses to go through that. That's the first half of the book. And then the second half of the book are stories about how certain businesses got launched using those tools from the front end. So it's descriptive from a design perspective, but also again gets into a great bit of detail. I was taken with the principles from the very beginning. So there's articulated up on the screen, you can see it, 14 leadership principles. And we don't have time to go through each one of them, but one of the things I'd like to start with, Bill, is we've all been in companies where they have their list, 8 values, 8 principles, 10, 12, 14. They show up on the wall someplace, they get sort of laminated into things people carry around in their wallets, and many times don't go beyond that. So can you tell us a little bit about the role that these leadership principles play at Amazon and how they actually function?
Yeah, so that is one of the most remarkable things about Amazon and these principles is that, yes, as you point out, all too often, they're just a poster on the wall. They don't really mean anything. They don't affect how the company does work. Jeff Bezos and his leadership team spent countless hours, days, weeks, sweating over each one of these principles. And, you know, if you go to the Amazon website, just Google Amazon leadership principles, you can also then read the roughly two sentences that describe each one of them as well. And I can tell you that Jeff literally sweated over every one of those words, revised it. So number one, he put a ton of time and effort into these. And the reason he did that is because he was thinking about the problem and the challenge he would face as Amazon grew and scaled, which is the realization that he can't be in every meeting anymore. He can't hire everyone anymore. And how does he make sure that this whole company thinks and acts in a way that he would? And so not only did he sweat the details of these principles, but then he actually methodically pursued avenues to create mechanisms and processes that would be designed to reinforce them. And in doing so, he created, he called it himself, he created an invention machine. And in fact, this is really will be, if you ask me, one of his great legacies, and this is what we're trying to document in the book. These leadership principles are then supported by 5 core processes that define how the company makes hiring decisions, a process for how the company conducts meetings and makes decisions, another process for how the company goes about innovating and developing new products called the Working Backwards PRFAQ process that we named the book after this process. A process for how the teams are organized, how the company organizes, and then finally, a process for how the company manages businesses that are up and running by focusing on controllable customer-facing input metrics rather than output metrics like revenue and free cash flow. And there are elements of these leadership principles that are actually knit into each one of them. And a simple notable example is the hiring process of the company literally starts with every interviewer is going to be, you take these principles and you split them up among the interviewers, and they're trying to find out if the candidate meets the bar on these 14 principles. So they're everywhere.
Yeah, so it is a fascinating discussion. It's also interesting to me as I look at some of these, sometimes they're not necessarily inconsistent, but at one time you get a message like bias for action is sort of this notion of let's go forward, and we'll
Yeah.
get to this in a little bit. The working backwards thing is a very deliberative process of
Right.
spending a lot of time up front trying to figure out what we're going to do.
Yeah, so there are, if you look at some of these, there are natural tensions between some of them, and that is somewhat by design, because there are very few black and white problems and situations in this world, and so you have to be able to look at problems from various perspectives, and a lot of what these principles are designed to do is to apply, what's the lens you're going to use to make a decision. And the one at the top of the list there, customer obsession, is among the most notable, where in meetings that's very easy to looking at different decisions to actually fall back on the spreadsheet and what do the short-term financials tell you to do, where instead, by focusing on what's best for customers, you're often going to make a very different decision. So there are these natural tensions in between these things. And also, yes, the bias for action, all else equal, the company encourages people to move fast. But on the other hand, there are, when you're making, there's a distinction between when you're making what's called a one-way door decision and a two-way door decision. A two-way door decision is one where if you make that decision and go through the door and you don't like what you see on the other side, no big deal. I'll just walk back through the door the other way, and the cost of doing so is not that big. A one-way door decision is one where once you go through that door, it's a very expensive decision, and so you want to slow down. And so what Amazon does is to encourages very methodical and slow, deliberate thought for those one-way decisions.
Yeah. What's also amazing to me is if you're going to live to these and adhere to them as a kind of tenet, as you say, reflected in hiring, doing that while you're growing the way Amazon has been growing, probably the fastest growing company almost ever. I mean, to get to where they are, that's got to be a challenge.
Yeah, it is. And you think about it when, and that's actually one of the reasons why one of the very first formal processes the company came up with was the hiring process. So in 1999, that was the peak of the dot-com boom. That's the year that I joined the company. And to quote one leader in the software group, back then it was just one group that could fit in one big conference room. We had new people, new managers hiring new people. And so when that's the case, very quickly, you are going to lose track of your culture and lose track of any kind of filter for what and who you're trying to bring into your company. And so by being deliberate in stating, well, what are our principles? What does role model leadership look like at our company? How do we lead? And then coming up with a formal process to screen for that and look for that, that's what allowed one of the secrets that allowed the company to grow and scale while maintaining the culture.
Yeah. And so again, another kind of interesting observation, I find lots of CEOs that say people are our most important advantage and critical element. And then you ask, what do you do about that? And there's nothing beyond the normal hiring process. So real evidence here of deliberate thought and design going into this. I wish we had more time to dig into the principles, but there are a couple other things I wanted to dig into. And one is the topic of the title of the book on working backwards. There are a couple great examples that you give us. And there's a part of the book here which sort of describes a little bit of your window given this. So during the time you were there, and I think I'm quoting from you in this part of the book, I either observed, participated in, or acted as the leader of the development of the Kindle ebook reader, Fire Tablet, Fire TV, Prime Video, Amazon Music, Amazon Studios, and voice-activated Echo speaker and the underlying Alexa voice assistant technology. That's quite a journey. But it seems to me the working backwards piece is so central to this. I wonder if you might take maybe the Kindle example and give us a little sense of what that journey was like.
Yeah, so to set the scene, at the end of 2003, Amazon had about 5.7 billion in revenue, of which 77% were physical media products, books, CDs, DVDs. So number one, it was the vast majority of the company's sales. And number two, by the way, this business was actually seeing declining year-over-year growth. the growth rates were decelerating. Sorry, it wasn't declining in growth. The growth rates were decelerating. And at the beginning of 2004, there were already more than 1 million iPods out there. People were using Napster to swap music files. It was clear that the physical media business was not here to stay. And as Jeff stated, we were determined not to be Kodak, not to miss the transition from the analog media world to the digital media world. And so what do we do about that? So what a lot of companies would have done at that stage was to do a rush as fast as possible to go make an acquisition or perhaps launch their own iTunes clone. And that's not what Jeff did. He instead, we went down a path of a very deliberate process of ideation for what we build. Now, it started off with, my then manager and I, Steve Kessel, who were sort of the first two people on the ground for working on this initiative. We would trundle into Jeff's office, and forgive me for saying this, but I used the things that I learned in business school, and so did Steve. And we brought in spreadsheets showing the projections for how big these businesses would become, and what should be our market share over the time, and what would be the financial characteristics. And so what are the numbers? And Jeff would look up from those spreadsheets and say, where are the mock-ups? And what Jeff meant by that is, this is not actually really useful information for understanding how we're going to win here. I want to understand what we're going to build on behalf of customers. And more to the point, what I'd come to understand in the weeks and months ahead as we would work together, what can we invent on behalf of customers where we could create real value for them? And making an iTunes and iPod knockoff would not be creating value from his point of view. So we came back with some mock-ups, with some ideas, but that actually didn't go very well. So anyone who's ever tried to develop high fidelity website or application designs know that that requires a great, often a team of designers, takes weeks. You have to actually think through all the details of the experience. That's a very expensive process. And we hadn't really thought through all these details. And so those meetings didn't go so well. So Jeff said, I know, okay, let's stop with the mock-ups. Let's instead, everyone in this room, and by this time we had been growing and adding to the team, maybe there were 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 of us, everyone here, go away and write a document that says their idea of what we should go build. So we all went away and did that. And then 2 days later, we showed back up and we all read these things, probably sat down for 3 or 4 hours, read these documents and started to debate and discuss them. There's one document describing something called a puck. The Amazon puck would sit on your countertop and you'd say, puck, order me groceries. For anyone that may sound a little bit familiar. Another product, people would describe different solutions for how we might deliver digital media files that were unencrypted so people could share them freely. And then there was another idea about what we might build in terms of an e-reader. And now we were getting somewhere because it turned out that by writing them in Word documents, this was a much lighter weight process. Anyone could write a document. We didn't need designers. And by really describing them in detail, we could then have a meaningful discussion about them. And then Jeff took it.
But the scope of the charge originally wasn't to develop an e-reader. It sounds like it was figure out what we should be doing in digital.
Totally, yes. Like across the spectrum, it could be anything from, it could have been that we came out of the gates with a movie and TV show service. It could have been that we would develop hardware. It could have been, what we did later, which is develop our own motion picture and TV studio. Yeah. But we would get to those things later. But we started with this device, and we started with Kindle because we could come up with an idea that we thought we're reinventing something meaningful for customers. And the tool that ultimately we used to do that was that finally Jeff said, I know, let's write the press release for these products first. And the reason we're going to do that is that normally that's the last thing you do after you've designed it. And then you try to figure out how to sell it and why it will appeal to customers. Let's invert that process. Let's figure out why people want to buy it first. And in some cases, we won't know how to create the things we've described, but then we'll work backwards from there to figure out how would we actually build this thing. And Kindle was a perfect example of that because there were about 6 or 7 different technical and business problems that we didn't know how we were going to solve. it was going to use a new technology of an e-ink screen. It was going to be always connected to the internet, which was not a thing back in those days. It was going to have a vast selection of ebooks when there were only a few thousand available. It was going to have lower prices. All these things that then required us to come up with a game plan for that. If we wanted that device to put in customers' hands, we were going to have to charge off in about 6 different directions to solve a whole set of problems to make that product a reality.
Yeah. So I would imagine in the same situation for other companies that were more service-based companies, they would have joint ventured this with somebody. So
Yeah. So
why did you became manufacturers basically?
yeah. So the next logical thing is then you realize we're saying we're going to make our own hardware device, and people thought, what? That's crazy. We're not a hardware device company. We're an e-commerce company. We don't know anything about that. That's the province of Sony and Samsung. Why would we go do that? And the reason why we didn't go and partner, because there are plenty of ways you could have gone and done that, and you flew over to China, partnered with an OEM or ODM, and the reason why is that we were inventing so many detailed things, and if you really wanted to control the end-to-end customer experience, you had to build the thing yourself. You had to own the code. And we had learned that already the hard way because we'd already had that pioneering, there were no e-commerce SaaS providers for us to go to in the 1990s because we were the first. You couldn't hire someone with e-commerce experience. We had to build all this stuff ourselves. And we learned that by owning that end-to-end experience, that allowed you to continue to innovate and change and adapt on top of it. So we made the controversial move to then create our own hardware team down in Palo Alto by hiring, people from Palm and Apple and spooling up our own team.
Yeah, and what I found interesting about the description in the book is it represents a lot of deep understanding about what disruption really means. Because my sense was you and the team sort of figured out this is not just finding some interface device to transfer content in a different way. We need to build new capabilities because the world is going digital almost in everything we do. Yes.
A lot of companies have this sort of the skills forward approach, which is here's what we're good at. How do we leverage those skills to go forward? And the customer backwards approach looks at the world the other way, which is what do I need to create in the future that will add value for customers? And then you work backward from there to figure out, well, what skills and technologies and capabilities will I need to get there? And that continued on forward, whether it was with building, the Fire TV, Fire Phone, Echo, and Alexa, sort of think about all the voice recognition and voice capabilities the company had to build that they didn't have. So that pioneering spirit, continued forward.
Yeah, and the other thing I took from the book is that if I remember, you weren't all that crazy when you were about the assignment, when you were given this assignment to take on. You looked at it as a kind of a demotion?
Yes. Yeah, I was at that time, I was managing the majority of the P&L for the company's largest business, the US books, music, and DVD business. And, the conventional wisdom or thinking is, oh, how could there be a better job to have in the company? And so when asked to go work on this new thing with zero revenue and sort of there's no team, that didn't feel so good. But of course, in retrospect, and oh, by the way, there's a chance that it would have failed and it might have actually derailed my career if the digital media business hadn't taken off. It might have not been good for my career. When you step into these things, you don't know if you're stepping into a dead end or a rocket ship. But I appreciated years later that, of course, I figured out at the time too that, of course, this was an interesting opportunity and the chance to work directly with Jeff and to try to invent the future. So I was excited about the challenge, but had mixed feelings.
Yeah, and then later on, as you said, you had a chance to kind of be directly involved with or oversee lots of these other kinds of pushes into the digital world.
Right.
So a couple of the other things that Amazon does, which in a sense, one, I love this whole notion of communicating elements for a decision in a 6-page narrative. And the other one has to do with the way in which you created these single-threaded themes. So maybe we start with that first. So I see us living in a world, and most companies I interact with, where, if anything, there's an extremely high degree of technical and managerial interdependence, right? Especially if you're doing something where I want to leverage an existing capability, kind of notions of let's use economies of scale and share things. And so you find a lot of kind of matrix settings and complex circumstances. And you guys have Amazon has a different view of doing this. Can you talk a little bit about this single-threaded management?
Yeah. So in the early 2000s, we were growing quickly, and we had gone from being a book business to being across about 8 different product categories, and being in from one country to being in 4 or 5 countries. And so inevitably, we started to have all kinds of different needs and business requirements, and GMs, raising their hand for what they needed. And so we actually had a CFO at that time who'd come from GE, and Jeff asked him to say, okay, what's our solution to this? And he said, oh, I'm going to bring in this process we use at GE called NPI, new project initiative. And but I'll make it a lightweight version of it. And basically what this process involved is using more communication, more coordination, a central team that you would pitch all of your ideas to, who would then try to scope the technical effort and size them, and then decide which ones were the most important ones, organize all this information, and put it up to the senior management team. And this is what most companies do. In fact, so what we're trying to do is to basically start to coordinate more, collaborate more, and create special roles that were designed just for coordination. And that went horribly. You basically spent more time in meetings planning and less time building stuff. And no one liked that, starting with Jeff. So he said, you know what, we're going to go in the exact opposite direction of this. We're going to figure out how to organize so we don't have to coordinate and don't have to collaborate. And that was the same time when services-based architecture for designing software had come into vogue, and we had a whole lot of monolithic code we needed to break down. So we made the move to APIs, which basically started by then creating, okay, here are software teams where they own this set of code, they alone. And we came up with this concept of 2 pizza teams. And the idea is that the team is small enough that you could feed them in a meeting with 2 pizzas. So depending on your appetite, that means about 8 to 12 people. And each one of these teams would be single-threaded, focused on a specific area of the company. It could be software, it could be a business area, and they'd have one owner, and they'd focus on that and nothing else but that. And they'd still were obligated to come up with a detailed plan and document these plans and move them upward. Now, this in many ways was a good example of, again, where we experimented. And the initial experimentation, some of that worked, but parts of it didn't work. I won't go into the detail on the parts that didn't work. But over time, this morphed into a slightly different concept called single-threaded leadership. And really what Amazon figured out was that if you wanted to keep innovating, you couldn't make it someone's part-time job. And just going back to my digital media example, what Jeff could have said is he could have said to Steve and I, hey, go do digital media. You're already running the media business. Go hire some people and go do that. But if we had gone that route, there is no way we would have ever made a Kindle device, because 90% of our time would have always been sucked up by managing the largest business of the company. Yeah. And there are other examples of this where one of the most successful businesses of the company, which is Fulfillment by Amazon, that project was floundering. And it wasn't until the head of operations, Jeff Wilkie, took one of his VPs and said, stop managing, this huge part of worldwide operations and just go work on that project and that project alone. And then he was able to launch it, and that created so much value for the company. So that's how the company organizes.
Are there tensions, though, at times when there's knowledge that you want to leverage from the old to the new, or there's shared resources? And so
yes,
you can't have total independence. How do you sort of manage that end?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I have come to appreciate, every org design is a compromise, and you're optimizing for something, but then you're sub-optimizing for something else. Right. And of course, a great example is technical engineering excellence. So if you have so of course, I'm not a software development engineer. And so my ability to, I never had the ability to do an architectural review or a code review. And so, but later in my career, I would have an organization with more than 1,000 software development engineers. So but it was critical for me to maintain the engineering excellence in that organization. And so we had different mechanisms for that. For example, there was one committee that for very senior engineering promotions, some of the most technically astute vice presidents and directors in the company, yeah, they had to approve that, and you had to go before that committee. There were mechanisms for architectural and code reviews where principal engineers would float to different teams in the company to help bring and spread best practices. So you have to create other mechanisms to sort of compensate for these things. And yes, it was no nirvana where you didn't have times when you didn't still share some resources and you still had to have some coordination. And it also meant you had duplication of effort in some cases. So there are trade-offs with it for sure, but I can tell you that it's a proven way to maintain a culture of innovation.
Yeah, yeah, and if you're constantly developing new stuff, you need that vehicle and the focus to kind of get it out and going.
Right.
Yeah, interesting, great. Can we shift to the communication piece? So I felt some personal kind of vindication when I saw this reference to 6-page narratives, because for decades I've been making my MBA students write case analyses, and I limit them to 6 pages. And interestingly, one of the things that I find is some of them will come back and say, well, do you want PowerPoints? And I said, no, I want your narrative. I want to understand your thought process on this. And I've stuck with it because I realize in most companies, I don't think executives write very much. And I don't even think they read I mean, they may read, spreadsheets and those kinds of things. But I see this as sort of central to what we always try to install, critical thinking ideas. Can you describe a little bit this as a vehicle for communication, sort of where it came from and how it pays off?
Yeah. So again, this is another example of where where Jeff and the company were up for experimentation and innovation, not just in products but in process. So the executive summary is that Jeff and his senior leadership team would have weekly meetings. They would be 4 to 5 hour meetings. These are expensive meetings of Jeff and all of his directs. And my co-author Colin Breyer was his shadow, his chief of staff at those times. And they would have a lot of frustrating meetings where they didn't feel like they were actually getting through the material on time. They weren't really getting to make decisions. They just felt like they weren't very efficient, and so they'd been reading the work of Edward Tufte, the Yale professor, and he had been writing about the way that PowerPoint is really not the right method for businesses to make decisions, and they should be using written memos or narratives. And so they said, great, we're going to experiment with that. And literally, my co-author Colin sent the email out to the company that says, from now on, in all meetings, no PowerPoint, written documents. And I can't begin to tell you the uproar that ensued when everyone's like, what are you talking about? And so the change management was rather abrupt. And the first documents that people wrote were quite laughably bad, and we had problems with run-on documents. We had to experiment with what was the right page limit. And over time, we figured out that it takes about 3 minutes to read a page. So you want to have about 18 minutes for reading, 2 minutes for chit chat, and then 40 minutes for discussion. So no longer than 6 pages for a 1 hour meeting, 3 pages for a 30-minute meeting. And what we found was that it was so much more, the meetings were so much more effective. And here's why. So if you have a written document, you can, you're going to communicate about 7 to 10 times more information than you are with PowerPoint, because people can read faster than they can listen. And not to mention the pixel density in a Word document is a lot higher than PowerPoint, where in fact you're taught to have as few words as possible. Yeah. Furthermore, it forces the author to actually have clarity of thought, to take, most business problems have disparate, data points and are your conclusions need to be drawn from a variety of data points that may seem unconnected. And the author's job is to draw the line through them and connect the dots for the reader to make the clear picture of like what's really going on here. And the job of the author is to meet that sort of inoculation test of anticipating the objections from the audience, of anticipating possible risks, and then addressing them directly in the document. And when you do all this, you have transmitted much more information in that 20 minutes, where literally the way an Amazon meeting works is people sit down, chit chat, then read the document silently for 20 minutes. And then you go around the room and have a discussion. And after 20 minutes, everyone's on the same page. They all have the same information. There's none of this interrupting people with PowerPoint. And then the quality of the discussion and decision-making that can occur in the remaining 40 minutes is just so much better. And when you think about the number of hours in the day, the week, the year, and multiply that times the 7 to 8 times advantage of additional information you're gathering, you're going to have a leadership team that is much more informed and able to give much more granular feedback to the various teams inside the company, which is honestly one of the short answers to the question, which is how is Jeff Bezos or Andy Jassy managing everything from cloud computing to Hollywood movies? And that's actually one of the big answers right there.
Yeah. What kind? Every meeting has these, or are there certain kinds of meetings that you use these on?
Pretty much every internal meeting. External meetings with external partners, those are PowerPoint. A large all hands meeting would be PowerPoint. There's one particular type of meeting that's called the weekly business review, which is all metrics. But yeah, pretty much, any monthly business review, any operating plan, any new initiative, new decision, deal memo for, in my old job, we're going to go acquire these suite of films from Warner Brothers. Here's how much they're going to cost. Here's our analysis. Here's our recommendation. Yeah, pretty much every meeting. You literally go around. My day was 10 hours of stepping into a room, reading for 20 minutes, having a discussion, and then moving on to the next one.
And so was there an effect on maybe the number of meetings that you have or the quality of the meetings? I mean, what was the result of doing this? That just better decisions?
Yeah. So of course it's unquantifiable because we didn't do an A/B test of this, but you're going to meet for the same number of hours a day. You can't create more hours in the day. I mean, obviously some people can work longer hours, but no, we didn't change the number of hours we worked. What we changed is our effectiveness in each one of those meetings, in each one of those hours. And so you could make decisions effectively, be better informed. And oh, by the way, it's a great way to inform the whole organization. People say, oh, I missed that meeting. Here's the document. You'd be just as informed as if you were there.
Yeah. Interesting. Are there any of the other mechanisms you think we ought to mention as part of the kind of Amazon way of doing things? Because you talked about the bar raiser in the book, and
yeah, I'd say the other one that's quite noticeable is the focus on controllable input metrics. So a lot of companies, and actually when we first got to Amazon, so there you are, it's the last few weeks of the quarter, and you say, holy smokes, we're not going to make it our revenue number. What are we going to go do? And the reality is there's not much you can go do. If you're not on track to make the revenue number 3 weeks left in the quarter, good luck. Or if you do something, it's going to be some short-term move that you're going to regret later. What we figured out over time is to focus relentlessly on metrics that we could control that related to the customer experience that then affected the right output metrics, which are the revenue, free cash flow. And the Jim Collins book, Good to Great, which had a huge influence on the company and on me, really influenced this decision, where really what you're trying to figure out is what are the things you want to work on, if you work on them for a long period of time, will matter to customers. And in Amazon's case for e-commerce, those things were a really broad selection of items. at really competitive prices that get to me very quickly. And people will always prefer all three of those things to the opposite. And so we started to come up with all kinds of detailed metrics that would allow us to understand this. Everything from, if we promise the customer 2-day delivery, what percentage of the time were we actually meeting that promise? And what was our average click to deliver time? And what was our in-stock rate for items that were in the top 95% of customer detail page views and demand, and many, many, many others. And we would focus religiously on those metrics. We would talk about those all the time, not unit volume, not free cash flow. And this is also one of the distinctive things that has allowed the company to be successful.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. There's a lot of other issues I wish we had time to get into. One thing, it seems like Amazon's just getting into every business that's possibly adjacent to anything they're doing. But we'll hold on that one for another discussion. I would like to focus, the announcement that came, I think, this week or late last week, that Jeff is going to become more sort of a board role, less of a CEO role. And we chatted about this when we were sort of setting up our session for today. If I look at his history of somebody that I guess came out of finance and was a really smart analyst and probably didn't have anybody working for him, if he did, it was a small team. I am stunned that the traditional kind of founder trap somewhere along the way, he's managed to avoid. And so it's really an astounding journey that he's led the organization on. How do you sort of understand that? What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, so when I first got there, Jeff was definitely not the most skilled. He was a visionary and he could paint amazing pictures, but he didn't really know how to operate. And boy, I really wondered, like a lot of Wall Street did, if this thing was really going to work out, if he was going to run us off a cliff or not. Like, I didn't know for the first few years. I wasn't sure about that. But I changed my mind after 3 or 4 years, because what I observed was that he had an amazing growth mindset. So he spent a lot of time studying other companies. He would assign a different book for he and his directs to read each month and discuss it. He would study, he took a lot of, for example, a lot of the management techniques we would adopt at Amazon, we took from Toyota. He studied the way Toyota decided to make their company all about quality, and not really just for the company, but also for the country of Japan as they grew out of their, post World War II, where they didn't stand for quality at first.
Right.
And that's actually one of the reasons why he chose customer centricity. He literally believed like customer centricity could be right alongside quality as an important ingredient. He proactively sought out, the other thing is that he was so mindful of the fact that he couldn't be in every meeting, that he couldn't make every decision. And he's such a long-term thinker that he would make decisions and be planful, like, how can this company last for decades, well beyond me? And so that's why he went so methodical about putting in place these processes and structures that would allow the kind of thinking and kind of invention and kind of high focus on operational excellence to pervade the company, no matter how fast it grew and no matter how many countries it spread to. And so that will be a big part, as much of his legacy as the rest of Amazon is just how much I think the company will endure. And it was quite remarkable to watch him do it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it really is. And as somebody that likes to study questions of strategy, execution, and organization design, I'm really taken with the design of how the principles and the mechanisms and all these things come together. But I also note, it's actually one of the leadership principles, number 4, are right a lot, which to me says somebody's got to be making good decisions, and you got to be making good decisions on a consistent basis. And so it's not just the design. I guess maybe that captures the way you hire people and sort of other mechanisms that go around it. But it's pretty remarkable to me that he's had this career. It's very impressive, I guess, is the best way to summarize it.
Yeah, I consider myself very fortunate to have had a front row seat to it.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things we talked about a couple questions, and there's a couple others that I want to go to in a minute. But for people reading this book, and I know you've started a consulting practice to work with companies on some of these ideas. I think everybody looks at it's like you said, good to great, influenced a lot of companies. They took some of those ideas and they applied them. There's a tension in these settings when somebody reads a book like this and they want to apply it, because you've got, the academic in me think of this as path dependency. In other words, the Amazon is the product of its journey over the years, the learning and failures and successes, and sort of coming up with these processes and this whole collection of stuff. It's a challenge to imitate or adopt this. So what do you see those challenges to be? Somebody reading this book, they want to take it and use it. What guidance would you give them?
Well, the first piece of guidance I would give them is a lot of these changes are profound, and in most cases in a company, for a change to really stick, it often has to come from the top, or ultimately at some point, the CEO and the top leaders have to buy into it. Because, for example, you're not going to change the company's interview structure and practice without some buy-in. Now, there are plenty of ways these things could be piloted in certain groups, and there can be proof of concept, but it's very helpful for your CEO to buy in. The second thing is that so much flows from the principles. And when I've been working with companies, that inevitably and invariably is the place we begin. And it's not about adopting Amazon's principles. It's about a company discovering and describing their own principles, and then figuring out how to embed them, how to make those principles so they define what does great leadership look like in my company, and how do I embed them in everything I do. But look, there are some lightweight things that are easy to do. Just as I said at Amazon, we banned PowerPoint in these meetings and tried Word documents. Now, if it hadn't worked, we just would have gone back. Yeah. But it certainly requires some commitment, because I can tell you that people are going to grumble about it, and it's going to take some time before people get good at writing good documents. So these things require some commitment. It's a bit like I've described to you how to run a marathon or an Ironman. You can do it, but it requires some discipline and commitment to actually do it. Yeah, interesting. So a lot of this is extremely fascinating. I think Amazon's one of the most studied companies around, and I think you've given us a great tome to dig into much more detail and understand it much better. We talked about the pillars of the center that we're creating, and innovation in large companies is a piece of that. And a lot of what you're talking about informs that, even though Amazon did sort of emerge as a startup. But I'm curious, you've worked with startups, you've been an investor, and you've been kind of an advisor. What are the lessons for startups? We got a lot of students that are interested in creating their own companies, alums that are 10 years into a career, they want to start a company. How would you see the principles discussed in the book relevant to them? Yeah, so the first thing is just going back to that discussion about Jeff, being so mindful of, you don't have to be very mindful of this when there's 10 of you in the startup or 5 of you. You, the CEO, can communicate with everyone. You're in every decision. You're in every hire. Jeff didn't have to do this stuff when there were 30 of them. But if you're so lucky as to find product market fit, and then you start to grow from 30 to 75 to 150, you're going to have to put in place structure, because Jeff had this amazing saying, which is that good intentions don't work, mechanisms do. In other words, if something goes wrong and you tell people, well, try harder to do better next time. Well, I think we can assume they were already trying hard and wanted to do a good job the first time. So reminding them to do that really isn't gonna fix anything. Figuring out how to create a structure or a process will. The second thing I'd remind you is that, very quickly, the culture of your company, if you're not careful in cultivating it, it will happen to you rather than you making it happen. And one of the smartest things you can do is right away to come up with what are your leadership principles. And your leadership principles are not your values that you put on your website that explain what your company is to outsiders or customers. Your leadership principles are defining what does a great leader look like in my company? Because guess what? A great leader at Amazon may not be a great leader at Starbucks or Microsoft or 20 other companies. It's very, it's very different in each place, and it's your job as that leader to define what this means, and so then people know how to emulate that and how to go find and bring other people like that into your company. So you have to be very proactive in defining that leadership, defining your culture.
Yeah, so it's also interesting, I think, how self-conscious entrepreneurs might be, or self-focused in terms of being determinate of the design they want to go forward with. So for example, there's an alum that started a very successful company I had a conversation with, and he was growing at a really high rate. And he was so aware of the culture issues and what they were trying to build internally that he said there were times at which they turned away business because he felt like he couldn't keep the organizational capability and the kind of people that they wanted to hire at pace with the demands in the marketplace. And he just said, we're gonna do business a certain way, and we can't do it at that rate. And I'm not so sure enough people are that conscious about the culture and the principles and those kinds of things. It's easy to kind of chase the revenue, and I think sometimes that's a trap that you can fall into. Now, the other problem is you obviously don't want to be in a situation where you need the revenue, but it's a balance.
It is a balance. And a lot of times the other big lesson I had from my time at Amazon is that for a lot of big decisions, you want to go slow to go fast. You want to be very deliberate. It seems like you want to be deliberate in thinking through what is the product you need to go build to create value for customers. Because it seems like people confuse effort and amount of time coding and lines of code, for example, with results. And if you're writing the wrong software, that's not going to get you very far. You need to have a plan to think through. You save a lot of time by figuring out what you should build before you start building it.
Yeah, great. So we got a lot of students, I think, on the call, and in general, we interact with students all the time in our program offerings by the center, both undergrad and MBA. And we've got a lot of them that want to go build something, right? It's either a startup. It's remarkable the number of startups we're seeing among active students, but also those that want to go work in a big company and build something there. So that's a little different circumstance, I think, where especially the latter one, where it's not my company, but I'm inside a larger context. So what kind of advice would you give students for those that want to go build something in either of these two contexts?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually put it in a context that hopefully is, timely. So some of you may not have known who Andy Jassy was until a week ago, right, but hopefully you know who he is now, because he's going to be the second CEO of Amazon. And I knew Andy pretty well. So let me tell you some what you can learn from Andy, and my suggestion is to be like Andy. So the first thing to learn is when Andy came out of business school, he went to Harvard Business School. He could have taken a lot of jobs that paid him a lot of cash up front. I'm sure he could have gotten a job with McKinsey or Goldman or whomever. Instead, he took a job that probably paid him, the cash salary was probably a third of what he would have made. So he did not, he was thinking long-term. He was thinking about what am I going to go do where I think I'm going to learn a lot that I think is a big opportunity and an opportunity that resonates for me. The second thing to learn from Andy is he had some bad luck at the beginning of his career. So he landed in the marketing department at Amazon. And in those days, if you were the VP of marketing, it was like being the drummer in Spinal Tap. You would last about 3 to 4 months before Jeff would fire you. And so if you're working underneath that person, you're not gonna, that department was not seen as a high value add area in the company, where some of his peers were over in other groups and their careers were speeding ahead. Andy's was stalling. Yeah. And then to make matters worse, by the early 2000s, Amazon had brought in a guy whose name I won't use, but he came in from Procter & Gamble, and he was a very fancy talker about marketing and was wowing the senior executives. And those two, Andy and this person, seemed like they were neck and neck to become the VP of marketing. And, Andy, I can only imagine how Andy felt when this person who sort of jumped right in seemed like he was going to steal his thunder. And so you're going to have times where you can't, unless you're the CEO, you can't pick who you work with.
Yeah.
And you're going to have some times where there are turkeys and you can't let them get you down, because if you perform well over the long term, you're going to outlast those people. And that's what happened here. Andy eventually did take the leadership role in marketing. And then finally, Andy was thinking, again, he thought long term when it came time for him to take another job. So he went from that role to becoming Jeff's TA, his technical assistant. He followed him around to meetings for 2 years. And after that, he could have had probably any job he wanted at the company. Well, he decided instead, he took a big risk. He said, there's this new technology with web services. I think I want to go focus on that and see if I can build a business out of this. So he was an intrapreneur. He saw an opportunity. He did his homework. He was very detail oriented. He had had a non-technical background, but he studied the technology and he got to know it well, and he understood it well enough to see the opportunity. So he said, I'm going to focus on this and build this opportunity. And as they say, the rest is history. So, don't go for the highest paying thing in the short term. Go for the thing where you think you're going to get the best experience. You're passionate about it. You're going to learn. You're going to have setbacks. Andy had these setbacks with landing in the wrong group. Whether you're starting your own company or in a big company, no matter how good you are, you're going to have setbacks. Are going to happen to you, and you're going to have to plow through them. And you're going to have to, if you really want to do something big, you're going to have to be patient and then take risks. And Andy did that too.
And it sounds like having a sort of willingness to sort of, and I think you're framing this as a long-term view of, find something that's out there that's going to give you the opportunity to actually build something.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. I would coach people all the time early in their career, and they'd say, well, how do I get a big job like yours? I said, well, there's only two choices. You can move your way up the ladder over the next 10 to 15 years, or you can do what I did, which is I built it from zero.
Yeah.
Those are kind of the two ways, and whether that's inside a company or outside a company, that's kind of how it works.
Yeah.
And so you have to decide which way you want to go.
Yeah, good. Well, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, but I've really enjoyed this, Bill, very much. I have to tell you, I did greatly enjoy the book, and I encourage everybody here to go out and get it. I think we're actually raffling off a number of copies, so some people on the call are going to get their free version of it. But I kind of organized my thinking for these things in like 1.5 hour chunks. I probably could have gone 2 hours on this. Very rich stuff. Thank you so much for your time and your contributions through the book. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, and so excited to be part of this launch.
Great. Thank you.